The laughter hit me before the words fully sank in, sharp and echoing through the quiet of the living room. I had forgotten the anniversary, the one day that should have been marked with acknowledgement, yet I had thought my efforts, my careful planning, would speak for themselves. She laughed, not gently, not teasingly, but with a sharpness that cut deeper than I could have imagined. The sound reverberated in my chest, each note a reminder of a devotion unnoticed, of a love unrecognized. I remembered the flowers, every stem carefully chosen, every bouquet I had arranged, paid for with funds saved from months of sacrifice. I had envisioned the hall alive with color, fragrance filling the air as she and her partner entered. A moment of celebration that would be remembered. I had accounted for every detail, often at the expense of my own comfort, working late nights to cover costs, foregoing my own small pleasures so she could have this one night of joy. And yet, none of it mattered in that instant. Her laughter ignored the unseen labor, the quiet hours of preparation, the personal sacrifices made in the hope of creating happiness. I felt a sudden ache in my chest, a physical response to the emotional betrayal. My hands gripped the edge of the table as the words and laughter collided, leaving me raw and unsteady. The heartbreak was immediate, a deep, hollow pain that seemed to settle in my bones. I could not comprehend how the child I had raised, nurtured and devoted myself to, could respond with such mockery, such disregard for the effort that went unnoticed. My mind raced to make sense of it, to find a reason, a mitigating factor, but there was none that brought comfort. At 72, moments like this carry weight differently. Age brings reflection, yes, but also a sharp awareness of time slipping away, of opportunities missed, and of emotional connections that cannot easily be mended. The betrayal was not merely in forgetting the date. It was in the dismissal of a lifetime of care, in the erasure of intentions and sacrifices that had shaped the life she now lived. I felt vulnerable, exposed not in body, but in spirit, as if all the quiet devotion I had offered had been rendered invisible. I reflected on the countless nights spent managing the budget for the event, the hours negotiating with vendors, and the small personal comforts I had denied myself so the celebration could be lavish and memorable. I remembered her excitement in past years, the sparkle in her eyes when she first saw the hall adorned with flowers, the delight that made every effort worthwhile. And now, faced with her laughter, those memories were tinged with sorrow, a bitter contrast to the joy I had once felt. The unfairness of it all weighed heavily. I had acted out of love, not expectation, yet the expectation had been assumed by her, that I would remember, that I would meet her standards, that my devotion would be visible. The emotional betrayal was sharp because it came not from a stranger, but from someone who should have known the depth of my care. My reflection shifted between grief and quiet outrage, a mixture of sorrow and moral clarity that left me reeling yet resolute. Have you ever felt your efforts went unnoticed by someone you loved? I ask this now, as I sit in the quiet aftermath of her laughter. The question hangs heavy, a reminder that love and sacrifice do not always guarantee recognition, and that the pain of being unseen is real and profound. Even as the grief presses down, I am aware that the path forward will require both patience and reflection, a measured heart navigating the consequences of devotion misunderstood. I find myself returning to the details of that anniversary, the night filled with color, fragrance, and effort that she never saw. I had spent weeks planning every aspect, paying for each flower, each decoration, every single item that would transform the hall into a place of celebration. I remember counting invoices, balancing the budget, and sacrificing little comforts I had grown accustomed to so she could have a night that felt magical and unforgettable. Every detail mattered to me. Every dollar spent was an act of devotion she could not know. As I reflect on those efforts, my mind drifts back to her childhood. I recall the small sacrifices I made year after year, missing personal appointments to attend school events, skipping vacations to save money for her programs, working late nights so she could have opportunities I never had. Each choice was deliberate, made quietly, without fanfare or expectation of recognition. I see now that the life I provided, stability, comfort, and opportunity, was viewed through her lens in a way I could not have anticipated. Signs of misunderstanding began early, subtle and easy to dismiss at the time. A sharp tone when I suggested alternatives, a fleeting sigh when I could not meet her expectations, a quiet withdrawal when I offered guidance she did not want. I thought these moments were typical, nothing more than normal youthful frustration. Yet in retrospect, they were hints of a perception forming in her mind, that my choices, though made in love, were constraints rather than blessings. I think of the nights I worked overtime, the hours I spent ensuring the celebration was perfect, the events where I stood quietly in the background, making sure everything ran smoothly. These were moments of unseen labor, acts intended to bring her joy. Yet she had no way of knowing the full extent of the effort behind the scenes. The recognition I longed for never came, and in its absence, a disconnect grew between what I gave and what she perceived. The reflection brings with it a rising sense of injustice. Every missed opportunity, every personal compromise, every careful arrangement of flowers and decorations represents a lifetime of care and commitment, and yet it is invisible to her, unnoticed, perhaps even unappreciated. The seeds of betrayal, planted by misunderstanding and nurtured by unawareness, are beginning to take root in the emotional distance that has grown between us. I feel a quiet sorrow, but also empathy for her perspective. She has experienced only the life I provided, not the cost or the labor behind it. Her perception is incomplete, shaped by what is visible rather than what is real. And yet, that does not diminish the heartbreak of her laughter at my oversight, nor the pain of realizing that years of devotion can be dismissed so easily. Do you think children understand the sacrifices of their parents? I ask this because even now, as I recall every flower, every detail, every hour spent for her happiness, the question haunts me. Effort alone is not enough. Perception matters. And when perception is misaligned with intention, the results can be devastating. I carry both grief and moral clarity, aware that love, labor, and sacrifice do not always meet the recognition they deserve, and that sometimes even the deepest devotion can be unseen. Over time, I began to feel the shift in our relationship, subtle at first, yet impossible to ignore. She no longer sought my eye when we spoke, glancing past me as though I were a shadow in the room. Phone calls went unanswered, messages left unread, small invitations met with vague excuses. Each instance was a quiet reminder that the emotional distance between us was growing, a barrier forming that I could not yet comprehend fully. I reflected on the signs that had been there all along, small hints of resentment or misunderstanding I had brushed aside. A sharp tone when I offered guidance, a fleeting irritation at decisions I made for the family, or the brief withdrawal when I tried to engage. Each moment now felt significant. I could see the accumulation of these minor frictions creating a pattern, one that had gone unnoticed until it became unmistakable. The first major conflict arose over a choice I had made to protect the family's stability. I suggested an adjustment to plans she had envisioned, something I believed necessary to maintain balance and order. Her response was immediate and pointed, full of frustration and disappointment. I felt the sting of her words, the growing chasm between intention and perception, and realized that my actions, though made with care, were being interpreted as restriction or neglect. Internally, I wrestled with guilt. Had I overstepped? Had I misunderstood her needs in trying to provide structure and security? Yet alongside that guilt was a steadfast sense of responsibility. I knew my choices were made with her best interests in mind, even if she could not see it. That tension between guilt and duty pressed on me, leaving me exhausted yet unwilling to compromise the principles I had held for decades. As the days passed, I became increasingly aware that her withdrawal was intentional. She had started to pull away long before this conflict, quietly erecting walls of avoidance and disengagement. The patterns of distance were deliberate, signaling a need to protect herself or assert independence, but leaving me in a state of helpless concern. I could not reach her through reason alone. Each attempt to connect was met with polite resistance or subtle dismissal. The realization settled heavily on me. The estrangement was not accidental. It had been cultivated over time, fueled by perception, frustration, and perhaps misunderstandings I had failed to address. The helplessness I felt was accompanied by fear for her emotional well-being, for the erosion of our bond, and for the long-term consequences of unresolved tension. What would you do if your child refused to acknowledge your sacrifices? I ask this now, because it is the question that has weighed on me each day. The helplessness, the moral concern, and the quiet fear intertwine, leaving a sense of urgency and reflection that cannot be ignored. And yet, even amid this distance, I remain committed to understanding, to protecting, and to navigating the fragile terrain of love, duty, and misperception. One afternoon, an envelope arrived, its handwriting unfamiliar but deliberate. Inside was a letter from someone named Julia, a reporter who had been observing my daughter in ways I could not. The words inside were measured, factual, yet carried a weight of concern that immediately pressed on me. She described behaviors I had noticed only in passing: hesitation in conversation, fleeting glances, the subtle tension in her voice, and framed them within a broader context I had not considered. Reading the letter, a mix of unease and cautious relief settled in my chest. Julia detailed my daughter's stress and secrecy, the ways she had begun avoiding interactions that once came naturally. She noted the internal conflict she observed, how my daughter appeared torn between expectation, responsibility, and personal frustration. The patterns were unmistakable: missed calls, declined invitations, and subtle withdrawals that, at the time, I had dismissed as temporary mood swings. Seeing them laid out by a careful, external observer made the situation undeniable and grounded my concerns in something more concrete than my own worry. The letter traced a timeline of emotional distancing, offering insight into when my daughter had begun to disengage and the gradual escalation of avoidance. Each date and incident Julia recorded aligned with the quiet shifts I had felt at home: the minor dismissals, the subtle frustrations, the hesitant responses. The chronology helped me understand that the estrangement was not sudden, but cumulative, built over months of misunderstandings and pressures I had not fully appreciated. Julia also suggested that external influences might have shaped my daughter's perception of my efforts. Friends, colleagues, or other adults may have framed her experiences in ways that skewed her understanding, casting my sacrifices as controlling or insufficient. The thought was unsettling, yet it provided clarity. The estrangement was not simply a reflection of ingratitude, but a complex web of perception, influence, and miscommunication. I felt a mixture of relief, sorrow, and concern. Relief that someone outside my family recognized what was happening and could offer insight. Sorrow that my daughter had carried this tension alone for so long, misinterpreting devotion as neglect. Concern for how to proceed, knowing that understanding alone would not repair the distance, but might guide the steps I needed to take. Would you trust a stranger explaining your child's behavior? I asked myself as I set the letter down. I did not know Julia personally, yet her observations resonated with the patterns I had felt but could not articulate. Her perspective offered a lifeline, a chance to see the situation from an angle I had missed, even as it reminded me of the complexity and fragility of trust, perception, and communication within a family. As I pieced together the unfolding situation, it became clear that my daughter's resentment had roots I had scarcely considered. The pressures she carried, some from her own life, others influenced by people around her, had amplified the frustrations she already felt. Work stress, social expectations, and subtle judgments from peers had combined with her perception of my decisions, creating a tension that neither of us had intended. I began to see how these factors had fueled a growing sense of frustration toward me, even though my choices had been made with her best interests at heart. I recalled the tangible costs I had absorbed over the years. Evenings spent balancing the budget so she could attend programs I could not afford otherwise. Personal sacrifices that limited my own social and financial freedoms. Countless hours devoted to ensuring stability in our household. Each of these efforts, made quietly and deliberately, now seemed to have been reframed in her mind as constraints rather than protection. The recognition that my sacrifices might have been misperceived gnawed at me, sparking a mixture of grief and quiet outrage. The miscommunication between us had escalated tensions in ways I had not anticipated. Moments meant to express care were interpreted as criticism or control. Small decisions intended to guide her were viewed as limitations. The cumulative effect of these misunderstandings had created a barrier of resentment, one that had grown silently, imperceptibly, until it became undeniable. I could feel the weight of these unspoken misinterpretations pressing on me, compounding my sorrow and heightening my fear for what this rift might mean for our relationship. Julia's continued observations reinforced my growing understanding. Her careful documentation of my daughter's behavior, hesitation in speech, subtle avoidance, signs of internal struggle, confirmed what I had begun to suspect. External corroboration provided clarity. The patterns I had feared were real, and the sources of tension extended beyond my own actions. Seeing this through a measured, objective lens offered both relief and new urgency. Relief that my concerns were validated, urgency because I realized that action, guided by understanding, was necessary to prevent further alienation. I wrestled with my internal conflict. Part of me wanted to defend my choices, to explain the sacrifices and efforts that had been overlooked. Yet I feared that doing so might be perceived as defensive or dismissive of her feelings. Another part of me mourned the distance that had already grown, feeling the ache of perceived failure despite my intentions. Balancing these impulses required patience, reflection, and careful consideration of every word, every gesture, and every step I might take moving forward. Would you confront your child directly, or try to gather more understanding first? I ask this because it is the dilemma that has defined my days. Acting too quickly risks deepening the divide. Waiting allows resentment to solidify. The stakes are high, measured not only in emotional fallout, but in the preservation of the trust, love, and dignity that form the foundation of our relationship. Even in restraint, the responsibility presses upon me to navigate the balance between defense and empathy, guidance and patience, truth and compassion. I realized that the growing distance between us could no longer be ignored. The misunderstandings, the unspoken frustrations, and the lingering resentment had become too heavy to bear in silence. I arranged a meeting with a family counselor, hoping to create a space where truth could be expressed and emotions could be managed. Sitting in the quiet office, I felt the weight of years pressing down, mingling with a cautious sense of hope. Perhaps through careful dialogue, we could begin to bridge the gap. The conversation opened slowly. I spoke first, outlining the sacrifices I had made. The late nights working to ensure stability, the personal opportunities I had set aside, the countless hours devoted to planning celebrations and providing for her needs. I tried to present my perspective without accusation, seeking to illuminate the intentions behind my choices. The counselor guided us, encouraging a framework of listening and understanding, reminding me that clarity and patience were essential to navigating these sensitive waters. But my daughter responded with defensiveness. Every explanation seemed to strike a nerve. Every attempt at clarity met with tension. Her posture stiffened, her tone sharpened, and I could feel the emotional energy between us escalate. The counselor prompted me to remain grounded, to maintain calm while allowing her space to express her feelings. It was a delicate balance. The room felt taut with emotion, yet I knew that facing this tension directly was necessary for any progress. Internally, I wrestled with conflicting impulses. I wanted to assert the truth of my intentions, to ensure she understood the care and effort behind every decision. At the same time, I feared that pressing too hard could deepen her resentment or cause more emotional harm. Protecting her well-being while maintaining the integrity of my own actions required constant vigilance, a steady hand in the midst of a storm of feelings. The counselor's guidance helped, but the moral weight of these choices rested squarely on me. Through the dialogue, I began to recognize the importance of setting clear boundaries, not as punishment, but as a necessary framework to preserve respect, dignity, and emotional safety for both of us. The sacrifices I had made were real, and they deserved acknowledgement, yet so did her autonomy and emotional space. Defining these limits became a form of moral justice, a way to navigate love, care, and accountability without causing further damage. By the end of the session, a tentative sense of hope lingered. We had spoken, even if not fully understood, and a path forward had begun to emerge. Yet the fear remained. Fear that misunderstanding could persist, that the rift might widen despite our efforts. I left carrying both sorrow and resolve, aware that maintaining boundaries was not betrayal, but a protective act, a necessary measure to honor both her needs and my own. Is it betrayal to set boundaries with a child, or protection? I ask this now, understanding that the answer is complex, a balance of love, truth, and responsibility. In this delicate reckoning, I begin to see the first steps toward healing, measured and cautious, guided by moral clarity and the weight of decades spent in devoted care. Her message came quietly, a text that trembled with hesitance, yet carried the weight of weeks of unspoken emotion. She wrote that she felt guilty, ashamed even, for the way she had interpreted my actions. The anger, the frustration, and the laughter that had once wounded me now came with acknowledgement of her misunderstanding. She admitted that she had allowed external influences, friends, colleagues, and other pressures, to shape her view of my sacrifices, framing them as control or neglect rather than the devotion they had always been. Reading her words, I felt sorrow settle deep in my chest. The heartbreak was real, intensified by the knowledge that her resentment had been compounded by factors entirely beyond my control. Yet alongside the grief came a sense of clarity. The betrayal I had felt was genuine, but its roots were intertwined with perception, not malicious intent. Understanding this distinction tempered the raw pain with moral insight, allowing me to separate the actions from the intentions behind them. She went on to describe her internal struggle, the conflict between wanting to recognize my efforts and the persistent belief that I had restricted or burdened her. The guilt she expressed was palpable, and in that vulnerability, I glimpsed the person she truly was beneath the armor of resentment. I realized that much of the tension between us had been fueled by miscommunication, misperception, and the influence of others who had framed her experience in ways that heightened misunderstanding. The emotional climax of this realization struck me with force. Heartbreak remained, undeniable and sharp, but it was now accompanied by moral clarity. I could grieve the years of distance and the laughter that once cut so deeply, yet I could also acknowledge the complexity of her position. A child caught between gratitude and frustration, shaped by forces she did not fully control. The rawness of emotion was tempered by the understanding that intention, care, and love were constants even when perception faltered. Internally, I reflected on the limits of influence a parent can exert. I had given everything I could, time, effort, personal sacrifices, yet perception is shaped by experiences, interpretation, and context outside my control. Love alone does not guarantee recognition or understanding, and the realization that misperception can distort intention brought both grief and insight. I understood the fragility of relationships and the delicate balance required to guide without overstepping, to provide without controlling, and to love without demanding acknowledgement. What consequence feels fair for someone torn between love and resentment? I asked myself, knowing there was no simple answer. She had acted in ways that caused pain, yet her actions were partly the result of misunderstanding and external pressure. The question lingered, a moral puzzle that required careful consideration, reflection, and an acknowledgement of the nuanced reality of human emotion. Through it all, I felt a mix of heartbreak, sorrow, and cautious understanding. The anger I once carried toward her softened into awareness, tempered by the recognition that love, sacrifice, and misperception can coexist in ways both tragic and illuminating. The path forward would require patience, empathy, and a steady heart, guided by moral clarity and the weight of a lifetime of devotion. Now, in the quiet of the evening, I sit with the weight of all that has passed, the laughter that cut deep, the misunderstandings that grew like shadows, the unseen sacrifices that went unnoticed. They linger in my mind with a persistent ache. I reflect on every flower I purchased, every detail arranged for celebrations meant to honor her, and the countless hours of labor and care that she never knew. These acts were never for recognition, yet the absence of acknowledgement has left a hollow ache that I carry even now. I think about the lessons learned over these years. Communication cannot be assumed. Understanding requires effort from both sides. No amount of intention can guarantee perception aligns with reality. Parenting has limits, and even the most devoted efforts cannot secure gratitude or appreciation. I have come to accept that love is expressed through action, sometimes unseen, and that misperception, however painful, is part of the human experience. The moral question that arises is one I must wrestle with daily: cautious reconciliation risking further misunderstanding or permanent distance, preserving dignity, but forfeiting closeness. There is no simple answer, no easy resolution. The choice is weighted with both sorrow and responsibility. I recognize that each path carries its own consequences, shaping the future of our relationship and the legacy of my care. Even amid this uncertainty, I acknowledge the quiet strength that has sustained me. The heartbreak is undeniable, yet it exists alongside resilience, moral clarity, and the understanding that my sacrifices, though unrecognized, were made with unwavering intent. I have acted with love, guided by care, and tempered by responsibility, and that knowledge provides a measure of peace. Was justice and understanding and setting boundaries enough, or would I close the door forever? I do not yet know. The question hangs heavy, unresolved, a reminder that some wounds may never fully heal, and some gaps may never be bridged. Yet, in this unresolved space, there is clarity about who I am, what I have done, and the limits of influence I could wield. I hold both grief and growth in my chest. The sorrow for unrecognized devotion, the reflection on miscommunication, and the awareness of human fragility coexist with the personal strength earned through decades of care. There is no triumphant ending, no neatly tied resolution, only the enduring weight of experience and the lessons carried forward. In this quiet reflection, I find both regret and acceptance, a balance that allows me to continue living with purpose, dignity, and a steadfast heart.